Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. Today is, what is it, September 14th, 2023. And we're here today. We'll Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. As you know, this is a program that is near and dear to the hearts of Natalie Armstrong-Motan, who was the brainchild of it, and Jeff Kachavin and I, who co-moderate each week with an amazing colleague who agrees to speak, all in the interests of raising money for food banks. So there is no charge. We just ask that you make a donation if you're able, in any amount, to a food bank, either the one that the speaker suggests or your local food bank, one of your preference. And then if you'd be so kind as to let Natalie know, or Jeff or myself let us know, and we'll be happy to add it to our running total, however much the donation is. So thank you for your generosity. How much is that running total right now, Jeff? Where are we?
Thank you, Jean. I'm delighted to report our audiences have been so very generous in terms of contributing in honor of our great speakers. Since we began the series, our audiences have contributed the magnificent sum of $441,991.78. To our audiences and our speakers, thank you so much. Back to you, Jean.
Even that 78 cents will buy a couple of meals at from some of the food banks with their buying power. That's just fantastic. We're looking at coming up on 450,000, which is 4.5 million or more, 5 million meals, depending on the buying power of the food bank, and 500,000, here we come. So thank you so much. And let's get to it now. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Debra Dupree. She's going to speak to us on why aren't they listening, how to create change in a disputant's mindset. And I had the privilege of listening to Debra, Dr. Dupree, speak at an employment conference a couple of weeks ago, and it was just fascinating. And so I'm sure we're in for a real treat. She is a dispute resolution master, a conflict coach, a mindset doctor, and international trainer and keynote speaker. She's the host of the bi-weekly podcast, Decoding the Conflict Mindset, bringing thought leaders throughout various disciplines and teaching them about how to engage with their self and others through difficult conversations and negotiations. She's trained throughout North America, Australia, India, the Pacific Rim in workplace mediation, advanced strategies for dispute resolution professionals, and leadership strategies for the work world. And she currently serves on the Southern California Mediation Association Board of Directors and the Employment Mediation Panel, and is on the faculty for various American Arbitration Association programs. So it's a real treat to have you here, Debra. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your food bank, which is the Maui Food Bank, and the link will be in the chat, and then the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jean and Natalie and Jeff. It's delightful to be here, and I'm really honored to be asked to be here. We were just talking before everybody came on that we have lots of world tragedies going on right now. And so when we started making arrangements for this, Maui was first on my mind because of the recency of it. But I think many of us can probably say at some point in our life, we probably have been to Maui and Lahaina. And so it touches the nerve. It's been many years since I've been there, but, knowing that I've been there, the heartbreak and the losses are even more relevant. And I just felt that it was a very timely food bank to contribute to. And so I encourage everyone to reach out. But we also talked about Morocco, and we also talked about Libya. And so, more to come, unfortunately, that we have to do this in this kind of setting. But thank you for being here, everyone. I look forward to hopefully an exciting program this morning. Okay. Well, and thank you, Jean, for that introduction. And I sort of come into mediation from a slightly different background than a lot of my colleagues. While I've studied law, I never became a lawyer. While I've taught law school in ADR. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I come from a psychology background. And my own, personal story of my family upbringing is what led to my fascination with human dynamics and particularly people in conflict. And so it was only later after I got into my career that I really realized some of those early influences that shaped my career choices and my career paths. And so I always found it so interesting that how can such nice, educated people be in such conflict? And so I really dove into understanding what is the conflict mindset and how do we redirect it. And so what I hope to share with you are some key thoughts of things I've learned. I'll share with you that you're getting a little snippets of my recent TEDx talk when I talked about, we're talking, but are we really communicating? And taking a look at that. And I hopefully one of our programs, Words Matter, how to keep the courtroom lingo out of the mediation room, is hopefully coming up too. So it's about how do we influence. And so let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going. A few things about my premises here is that our world has changed phenomenally. Particularly with COVID coming in, and we certainly see the impact of mental health and well-being at work and at home in our communities. And so here's really an opportunity to really take a personal look at our own mindset as we come into our profession, come into the world of work of mediation, and just how do we more articulately and effectively identify people's needs, but then also have the techniques to redirect them, to change their mindset about how they're thinking about their dispute or their conflict. And so, as it says here, same old thinking, guess what? You get the same old results. And so again, I look at conflict as being not an adverse thing to avoid, but instead an opportunity. Where can we go with this now? And so that's sort of the foundation of some of my thinking. And so when we look at this, I'm going to tell you just a brief on the brain. I thought our attorney mediators would like that little word, a brief on the brain. And so a few things to keep in mind. People actually come into a mediation already in a way agitated because they're having to deal with their conflict that's probably been with them for a while. They're maybe never been in mediation before. And so they're already sort of in a heightened state of anxiety. And so from the very get-go, and I'm a strong advocate of pre-mediation, so I use my pre-mediation sessions to prepare the person to get them into a better mindset for the actual mediation. But going back to the brain science, it's that basic drive to survive, our fight, flight, freeze, and now we've learned fawn. People give in too easily to try to put the conflict behind them. And so this is natural. It's been with us the beginning of humankind, and our bodies are still largely wired the same way. Our threats today are vastly different from the days of running from dinosaurs and tyrannosauruses. But they're real to us, and we react accordingly. And so we also know that emotions will come up, oftentimes triggered, not necessarily, well, they may be triggered in the current moment, but they actually have their foundation in past moments, and particularly if we take a look at our childhood experiences. We know and understand the nature of trauma much more significantly today, even than when I went to graduate school 30 years ago. And so this is where the neuroscience is so fascinating, and where I really chose to spend my doctorate studies on, to better understand, going deeper into this emotional reaction. And so we probably all can identify with that, that pit of my stomach, or my rapid heartbeat, or my shallow breathing, or maybe just a brain freeze. Those are all signs of the physiological responses that people are feeling. And so what happens is that, our brain is really an organ just like any other part of our body. It just happens to house our mind, where we have cognitive thoughts and we have emotional experiences. And so when we're triggered, there's a whole physiological response going on, and therefore it interrupts what's happening in the brain, interrupts how we can get past the emotional experience into the cognitive realm where we have decision making. And when we experience different kinds of emotions, it leads to different kinds of decision making as well. So as you can see here, anger tends to lead to more impatient or rash decision making. Sadness or fear may be clouded by uncertainty and caution. And think about the clients that you work with who just can't seem to make a decision. They're oftentimes stuck in this fear pattern, or excited. They may be really quick to make decisions then out of excitement because they see it an opportunity for resolution. And so again, all of this is sort of happening behind the scenes, so to speak. And so I want to just show you a couple of slides that really sort of tap into what's going on and how can we pay attention. I hear a lot that, particularly as we transition to the virtual platform, I can't read the body language. And it's like, well, actually, there's a lot of things, if you know what to look for, you can. And so, I mean, just even looking at this picture of the eye, I mean, you can see it's inflamed, right? There's stuff going on. So we see that the eyes are a roaring fire, the eyebrows are arched like an arrow, the temples are beating. You can even see that with our clients. The muscles in their cheeks may be flexing. And inside, they may be having this rapid heartbeat and having difficulty catching their breath. And so I like to say the brain is a cacophony, not a symphony. It's not orchestrated, it's just happening randomly and disruptively. And so with that, there's a few things I want to point out, again, from a neurochemical standpoint in terms of what triggers people in conflict. And I imagine a lot of you may be familiar with the work of Daniel Coleman. If not, he's considered sort of the modern day father of emotional intelligence. And for many years, he's called it the amygdala hijack. Well, having studied in psychology at the advanced level, it's always sort of confused me because I've read his books and it's like, why did he call it the amygdala hijack? Because that's just part of it. And so it's interesting because he's still alive and well and regularly posts on LinkedIn. And so somebody I would encourage you to follow. But I think it was sometime over the winter of 2023 that he made a post. He goes, I had it all wrong. It's not the amygdala hijack. It's really the emotional hijack, because there's a series of different brain components that go on in this emotional intensity or emotional response. So just from a neurochemical standpoint, we first get activated with adrenaline at the base of our brain. And I'll go into this a little bit more, tangibly. And so what does adrenaline do? It charges us up, it gets us going. And so that could be good or bad. And then it goes into what we call the limbic brain. And this is where we emit cortisol, which is one of our stress responses. And depending upon the person's past experiences and depending upon the intensity of the situation, we can actually experience what is a psychological term called flooding, where we have so much cortisol that's being emitted in our limbic brain that it impedes the neural pathways necessary to get to the prefrontal cortex, which is where we are humans up here, where we can think and analyze and be cognitive and make decisions and work calmer, et cetera. So this initial reaction actually can shut down our neural pathways to good decision making. So what happens? People become disoriented. They may get confused. Their ability to make decisions disappears. They're unable to hear and listen to different perspectives that might be presented in a mediation session. They almost become so focused that they can't see the bigger picture. And they tend to be very reactive in the moment. And so the good news I bring to you, but also not so good news, is that when we have this kind of intense psychobiological, neurochemical kind of reaction going on with the brain in a conflict mindset, it can literally take up to as much as 24 to 72 hours for the physiology to settle back down into that pre-triggered state. And so timing is everything, folks. And that's why it might actually, I remember the days of where we'd almost, reach resolution by starvation, where we'd go for, ad nauseum long days. And I remember one difficult mediation I did a few years ago, pre-COVID, we were actually there until 9:00 on a Friday night. We had Washington, D.C. still on the hook, making the final decision. We'd been there all day. But in retrospect, I could see, well, that we sort of wore them down, is sort of what we did. And where we may have benefited, say, okay, here's where we are right now, and let's come back to this. And so I want you to keep that in mind. Follow-up is really important. Checking back in with people. People generally, I would say about 50% of the population generally needs time to think through their decisions and their experiences. And so I use a lot around communication styles as well. So this is just some of what's happening biochemically in our brains. And so there's a ton of research going on out there right now. I was excited to speak at a physicians conference last fall. And so I had so many questions from doctors not knowing all this stuff, but Stanford's one of the leaders, Rutgers, of course, Harvard. And so really taking a look at, again, how does this whole neurobiological, physiological experience play in? And in the figure, it may be a little hard to see on the screen, but what happens unless we develop what I call more of our emotional intelligence, which is self-awareness, self-management, other awareness, and relationship management, we can get short-circuited in the limbic brain, which is marked by the thalamus there. So you can see where the arrow is going up, and then it sort of loops back really quickly and triggering with the amygdala. Instead, we want to learn to pause in those triggered moments and help our clients pause in those moments, so the neural pathway can actually get up to the what's called the frontal cortex or the prefrontal cortex, which is way up here. That's our human intelligence brain. We're the only species that has that. And so that's where we want to learn how to pace and time things and be aware, pay attention to some of those physical reactions we see going on in people's faces, particularly their faces, but it can also demonstrate itself in other parts of the body. And so just looking at these pictures, I mean, you can see a change of expression and they reflect different emotions. Wouldn't you agree? We want to move somebody who may be all the way to the left, or maybe the second one, worried and anxious about what's going on, and get them to the point of where they start relaxing and they can actually, for lack of a better word right now, have fun through the experience of being courageous and curious to learn where's the other person coming from when we're in a dispute resolution process, when we're in conflict. And I had a guest speaker in my podcast just earlier this week who talked about, I don't refer to it as resolution anymore. Instead, I talk about bringing closure to the conflict that exists between two parties, however many that might be. And I really thought that was a nice way to reframe, because we may not necessarily resolve things, but we can bring closure to the conflict that brings them to mediation. And so you'll probably be seeing that in our next work with Harold Coleman on words matter. And so the words that we use in mediation, either by the mediator or the advocates, as well as the parties, can actually fuel these neuropsychological, biological, chemical reactions just by the words that we use. And so that's why we talk about words matter. And so we know, I mean, back in the day when I went to graduate school, there wasn't much attention given to feelings, even though I was in psychology. We really talked about cognitions, cognitive behavioral therapy, and it works. But what we now know with the neuroscientific background is that those kinds of changes don't tend to be as long-term. But if we now focus on the emotional aspects preceding our cognitions, we tend to be successful in longer-term outcomes. And so, it's basically identifying underlying interests as opposed to identifying, solutions too quickly. And if we know what we're looking for, we can really glean a lot of information from those emotional displays. And this sort of goes back to what I said already. Keep in mind, our clients are coming in already bothered, disturbed, anxious, whatever that might be. They already have an emotional presence going on for them. And so again, our demeanor, our presence, as I know you know, makes such a difference. And I'll explain that in just a moment too. Now, as it said in the write-up, I was going to introduce you to 10 common triggers and 12 cognitive distortions. For the interest of time, I'm just going to touch on this lightly. But in my later slide, I do provide you with a link. I've completed a series of short videos, like just 2 or 3 minutes, on the 12 cognitive distortions, so you can dive into that and know how to redirect that, because that really underlies a lot of the mindset that people bring into the mediation session, and gives you some ideas about how to change that, how to shift that mindset. But this, and I also have a series in the process of being released on the 10 triggers. And again, these are oftentimes underlying factors that may be driving people in considering what options might exist. And these triggers are oftentimes linked to those past memories, those past experiences. And so if we can identify, what's happening for somebody and ask questions around this, then we have the opportunity to reframe them. So for example, rejection, well, actually, what is somebody really looking for? Acceptance or approval. Or let's say somebody is, feeling challenged beliefs. Well, it could be that, they don't feel that their perspective is being considered or regarded. And so that's where we want to help them, find voice. Well, and I talk about perspectives, not positions. Perspectives is, this is how I see it. How do you see it? And then we learn from each other about that. So this is an opportunity for you to actually reframe these. And that's what my video series will talk about. Normally what I'd like to do is break you all into groups and have you practice with that and see, learn from each other as far as how to reframe that. But that's what we want to do, just like our, reframing is one of our most valuable techniques that we have. And so this is an opportunity to give you something to focus on specifically. And again, this is not my findings. I've used this from my research and applied it to the practice of mediation. And so I look at we as mediators as influencers for positive change. And that's where then our techniques for how we achieve that becomes so important. Asking open-ended questions, or reframing the negative triggers to positive needs, and redirecting from confrontations to learning conversations to uncover what's important to others. And so those are key points that I really want to emphasize here. And with that, then I want to just share with you, when we talk about the changing world, sort of what's going on based on some recent stats. So I do mostly employment mediation. And so what's going on there right now, EEOC is very hot with some major decisions coming out, particularly around medical conditions in the workplace, which is another one of my niche markets. But as it says here, the current pandemic is not just a public health crisis, it's an economic and a civil rights crisis. And I'll show you some stats shortly, but as it says here, the COVID-19 and economic fallout has affected certain segments of the population more so than others. And these actually line up with the 7 protected characteristics under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And so it does come up. And so these are the different kinds of discrimination or types of discrimination claims that people may file. And what I have learned over my 20 plus years of being a senior mediator in the Department of Navy, that yes, we have that. It's very clear, the 7 protected classes under Title VII. But when you really dive deeper into what's driving people around those claims, it often breaks down into people differences. But we all have these all protected rights. And so it's easy to put a claim under that. But when you break it down, it really gets into communication, relationship building, and how our individual styles play out. And that's led to some of the development of how I approach mediation and working with clients. And what I try to bring to some of the teachings that I do through the ABA and the AAA and some of the other work that I'm doing. I'm excited. I'm actually going to be working with a legal group in India where I've done some work before, and talking about the psychology of conflict as part of a series. And I'll share with you this little story. When I first started teaching ADR for Cal Western School of Law in San Diego back in 2007 or 8, my first couple of years of teaching ADR, my students would go, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea there was so much psychology to negotiation and mediation." And I said, "Well, duh, it's people. Of course, you're going to be dealing with people in conflict, then you need to understand some basics around the psychology of people." And so certainly we've grown a lot in the last 15 years around those concepts, and we see a lot more application of compassion and empathy and things like that in terms of how we deal with people. But here are the most recent stats available from EEOC. And what we can see is retaliation is our #1 charge. And so this is where people feel singled out and for those protected classes. And we certainly see that sort of a characteristic, unfortunately, nationally, on a lot of different levels, but it definitely carries into the workplace. So people don't feel safe. People don't feel psychologically safe. And that's the other thing I talk about a lot. Since the Golden Gate Bridge, which is one of the first times we saw major safety initiatives that saved, tons of lives, we haven't done very well around psychological safety in the workplace. And that, I think that's really reflected in all of these levels of statistics that are going on, and it keeps growing. There are some other stats that I could show the differences between the filings and so forth. But again, it's a serious issue, and that's a lot of where I spend my time. Disability happens to be one, like I said, one of my niche areas. And that has seen a major increase in the last few years, and particularly as we're dealing with things like COVID related long haul effects. That comes up more and more in terms of the impact on people's ability to work and earn a living. And so I track these kinds of things a lot to see what's going on for the people of the world, because most of us are all, working or employed somewhere in some capacity. And so we are seeing increased resolution rates. EEOC adopted a mediated approach to their complaint handling back in the 90s after the ADA was implemented, and really looked at the interactive process. I know I was an early adopter of the interactive process, which is a form of mediation, but we are seeing better results with that kind of thing. And so moving on from a little bit of the brief on the brain and some of the stats driving human behavior in the workplace today, I want to share with you some strategies then for just how do you shift the mindset. Again, I'm going to share with you some resources just because I've invested a lot of my COVID time to turning some of my knowledge into short videos and stuff, and we use regularly in the trainings I participated in. But to give you opportunities to continue to learn. I like to say it's really important, particularly as mediators, that we are courageous enough to be curious, and then we pass that on to our disputants in the mediation process, to encouraging them to be courageous, to be curious, to learn how other people see things, and from that, developing a source of options, opportunities to reach resolution and closure. So again, mediators as influencers, we want to create that safe harbor. Throughout my life, I've always done a lot of boating and water activities, and so maybe you recognize this photo. It's actually from Avalon Bay in Catalina, one of my favorite places to go, just 26 miles across the sea. But I use the metaphor of a harbor because when you're out in the open sea, you can face high winds and high seas, and it's scary. I've been out there, and so you want to duck into a safe harbor, and so that's really what we as mediators want to create through our mediation process, that safe harbor, and so that people feel comfortable enough, relaxed enough, not as anxious as they might have pre-mediation, to come in and be ready to engage in a good faith effort in ways that can help move the parties to mediation. I also want to share with you the quote by Brene Brown up there in the upper left. I define a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes, and who has the courage to develop that potential. And so, again, I see mediators as influencers of moving towards, dealing with conflict. And therefore, we need to model the way, the psychological safety in every connection. How are we showing up? And you'll see shortly, a lot comes through our tone of voice, more so than the words that we use. And so again, creating a supportive environment, and then fostering yes in small ways that create comfort and safety, because the more times we can create opportunities for our parties in conflict to say yes, it's shifting the mindset. The no comes from a different part. It tends to be more of a reactive, but saying yes is reaching more back into the higher levels of cognitive functioning. And so small ways. So one of the things that I've been studying over the last 10 years is this whole notion of compassion, because I think we all recognize the role of empathy in how, as mediators, the importance of demonstrating empathy. But like with a lot of words we have in our English language, Empathy is actually a component of a bigger picture. That bigger picture is compassion. And I borrow from the Dalai Lama, who in a New York Times Square speech several years ago talked about compassion as really being nothing more than warm-heartedness. And for me, that really sort of shifted my mindset and my response to that whole notion, because compassion, I think, for a lot of us can feel really overwhelming. It's like, I think of Mother Teresa, for example. It's like, well, I'm not going to go there, entirely that direction. But when he talked about warm-heartedness, it really tapped into then showing up with care and concern, showing up with compassion, using our emotional intelligence so that we can influence, persuade, and create an atmosphere of compassion and dignity. And so it's important to keep in mind that as we try to change the disputant's mindset, as we try to redirect confrontations to conversations, it really is an intricate interplay. There is that arousal component. There's a physiological response. That dance of chemistry I mentioned earlier. And this is where it's so important that we as mediators, but we all as mediators also help our disputants in our mediation to shift back to that higher order of EQ or emotional intelligence. And we need to help create pauses to let them to foster how they can take it back to the prefrontal cortex. And then there is this interplay of the different chemicals. I talked about adrenaline and how it will charge us up positively or negatively. I mentioned cortisol being our natural stress response, and that too much of it can actually lead to a flooding, impeding people's abilities to get out of that emotional lockdown and into the higher level of brain functioning. Instead, we want to show up with care, concern, and compassion so that we are more effectively activating some of the other chemicals in our brain, like oxytocin, not Oxycontin, okay, oxytocin. And oxytocin is what we call the brain or the love chemical, our feel good, I'm in love kind of thing. And that has a whole range of emotions that go with it. So it's not just love, but again, feeling good about what we're trying to do. And then dopamine is we want to reinforce the reward center, and so that's where I talk about, acknowledging people for their efforts, their presence, their contributions, their statements of, awareness, apology, things like that. And then two, serotonin, by slowing things down, we actually have a positive effect on serotonin, which contributes to, when too much serotonin will contribute to a higher state of anxiety. So by slowing things down and making sure that we're cognizant of our tone, volume, and inflection can help create that. Pacing things, let's take a break, have a drink of water. All of that will influence how the brain functioning is working so that they can shift back out of that emotional intensity that they might be feeling and back into the prefrontal cortex, the human brain. So how do we know this? Well, based on studies that actually emanate back from the 1950s, when there was a lot of research going on to the psychology of what happened for veterans coming out of World War II. We've known this stuff for a long time, but I'm always amazed about how many times people don't know this. But 55% of how we communicate isn't what we say. It's through our facial expressions, our body movements, our arms. Are we looking up? Are we looking down? They mean different things. Looking up is sort of a sign of encouragement and positivity, hope, where if you're looking down, it's more of dejection, despair, this isn't going anywhere. And so this is where a little study in body language becomes really important, I believe, for mediators to learn and understand how to read things, even on the virtual screen. You may not see that foot tapping like you might in your mediation room. My guess is you probably wouldn't anyway, because everyone sits around a table, usually hard top that you can't see through anyway. So 55%. Why? What we see actually goes back to the back of our brain, to our audio and occipital lobes. Then it goes back up through the brain, through the amygdala, through the limbic brain, back up to the prefrontal cortex. So we tend to have a physiological response to what we see before we even make sense of it. We naturally, that drive to survive, we fight, flee, or freeze or fawn. And then 38%, as it says here, is through our voice, our tone, our inflection, our volume. And so again, things getting intense. Okay, let's sit back, let's calm down, and drop your voice yourself. Amazingly, the powerful effects that just the tonal quality of your voice can have. And as it says here, only 7% are the words that we use. But if we add words that tend to be inflammatory like I know, oftentimes we'll talk about the opposing party. Well, that doesn't suggest collaboration. That's not moving people closer to reaching closure about their issues. And so, so words are incredibly important. And that's why, I'm fostering, trying to create awareness about the words that we use and how we can shift the mindset by selecting words that are less inflammatory. Again, even the saying no, or I'm not going to do that, that will tend to activate the limbic brain, which is where we have that our emotional center. And again, when we get the limbic brain going, we interfere with the ability to get back up to the prefrontal cortex to listen to what is somebody saying. Okay, and this is where the mediators techniques become so important in redirecting that. Okay, I hear you saying no at this time, but what would your proposal be? What other options exist? So expanding it back in rather than shutting it down. And so this is what we know. And again, it gets back to how our brain is structured and how the parts of the brain that are activated along the way. Because what we've learned, and this comes from the work of Stephen Covey, is that the biggest communication problem is that we don't listen to understand. We listen to respond. And I usually have some techniques I like to take people through, but just think about your own experience. If you're engaged with somebody, how many times are you actually giving them their full attention? And instead, you're already busy processing your answer. And whenever I put that out there, people go, oh, yeah, I see what I'm doing. Yes. So listening is actually being silent. Another Coveyism is seek first to understand before you seek to be understood. And so again, this is, shifting just the whole communication pattern between people as well to focus on what is being said. And that's why, again, some of the skills we as mediators, gain and apply becomes so important to help redirect people and to help open up their listening ability. So one of the things I like to say, I've sort of used these words already, but I'm going to ask you to do something with me. So see the word listen, okay? Now, a lot of people will say that that's synonymous with hearing. Well, it's not. Hearing is the audible sound. I hear you talking, but I'm not listening to what you're really saying. Or I hear that sound, but I'm not really processing or listening to what that means. And so we have a bunch of words like that, even with empathy and compassion. That sounds similar, but they're really not. And it really ties back again to how it's triggered in the brain. So I want you all to write down the word listen on a piece of paper in front of you. Okay. Then I want you to write down the word silent. And I asked, take a look at those two words. And what do you notice about those two words? Now, if you've taken my training before, you probably have already know the answer. So what do you notice? Anybody? Well, I'll tell you. Listen and silent actually have the exact same words. Or letters, I'm sorry. They have the exact same letters. And so to listen, we first have to be silent. And not just what's coming out of our mouth, but also what's going on in our head. We again, going back to Covey's statement, we don't listen to understand, we listen to respond. So we need to be quiet up here as well. And not everything that jumps in your head has to come out of your mouth. One thing I've learned in the work that I do with people is that when something does jump into your head, that's exactly what you want to not say, because it tends to come out in hurtful, harmful, and damaging ways. And so that's why our ability to slow things down and really engage people in a way to listen with full attention. So I use this kind of thing in my training programs a lot, particularly when I'm working in the workplace to help managers and leaders say, are you really listening to your employees? And what does that mean? Because what I've learned about people in conflict is that we have a natural tendency to react, again, the drive to survive. And they do tend to say things before they think about what's really going on. And they also tend to take things personally. They feel attacked rather than, okay, what is this person saying and what can I learn from it? Is there some element of truth that I should take note of this? Instead, they get defensive. And in turn, they redirect the attack on somebody else. Well, you did this, so that's why I did this. Like, whoa, slow this down here. And then the last thing is that they respond in defense, and I already said this. Then is they redirect the attack back to the other, and that's exactly what happens in retaliation. Then, and so being mindful of this, and again, moving away from the attacks become critically important. And this ties back to something I said earlier, in terms of the influencer's mindset. And I'll share with you a little technique I have called the 3 Bs. But as out of adversity comes opportunity. A lot of people have a fear of conflict. But I've long said, and Natalie might remember this from back in some of our earlier days with Dan Dana and Craig, also Craig Wunderlich from Eckerd College with the conflict dynamic profile, is that, it's conflict in of itself is not the bad thing. It's how we manage it. And so if we can reframe conflict as an opportunity to learn, then we can shift the person's mindset about conflict too. Many people, a good third of people would rather avoid conflict than ever deal with it. And yet that doesn't resolve anything either. And sometimes we have to feel the pain in order to get that momentum, that charge to actually gain. And while I wish I could say that, well, I did originate these, but guess who's been saying it for years and years? Albert Einstein. In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. If you take a look at the words of Einstein or Thomas Edison, it's out of our failures that we've learned and actually made significant discoveries. And so sometimes it has to be painful in order for us to move on. So one of the things I'll share with you, it's called the 3 Bs. And again, I used COVID to turn a lot of my techniques into short little videos because I wasn't seeing people. And so I thought, well, this is a good instructional way. But the 3 Bs is a way of teaching people to just be in the moment, just sit in the moment, not even analyze what's going on, but just notice what you're experiencing. And this goes back to what I said earlier, that gut, that pit in the stomach, that rapid heartbeat, that shallow breathing, the brain freeze. What's going on for you physiologically? Because that's their first indication that they're triggered in some way. And so this is where, when we slow things down and engage them in some calming activities in the beginning, can be very helpful for preparing them for getting further into the mediation. Now, this is where I use my pre-mediation, where I work one-on-one with people, so I can sort of assess where they are and then apply some strategy. Then the second B is breathe through the moment. The power of deep breathing, folks, don't underestimate it, because we all breathe, but quite frankly, we oftentimes don't breathe in ways that actually serve us well. And that's where the shallow breathing and the tendency for panic attacks comes, is that they're not getting enough oxygen. So breathe through the moment. And again, I have a 4x6 technique, breathing 4 times, 6 times a day to get into the habit of that. And it has a lot of powerful internal physiological effects. And then the next B is break free from the moment. Because by doing the deep breathing, it slows us down, it slows the brain activity down. And then by breaking free from the moment, I want you to visualize, how you want to walk out of this mediation room. How do you want to bring closure to this? How do you want tomorrow to look like, knowing that this conflict is behind you? And so visualization takes us back to the prefrontal cortex. And so that's where we can break out of the emotional strangle in the limbic brain and get them back into the prefrontal cortex. And so this is a very simple technique. You can walk somebody through it very quickly. And again, I have a little video and short on my YouTube channel that you could go watch and apply it to yourself. My stuff is free for you guys to use. And I just put together the things I've learned that have worked well for me in my practice of dealing with people in conflict. And I'll just acknowledge, though, too, most of my employment mediation is less legally based, although I've done a lot of Title VII mediations, but tends to be more relationship based. People who are just not getting along. And there could be some potential for a claim under the protected classes, but well, I really advocate trying to get an early start on relationship difficulties. And so I go reduce tension and improve retention, because people leave, and this stat's been around since 1998 from the Department of Labor. They did a very exhaustive study looking at why do people leave good organizations. And as they got into it, even though people may have given lots of valid reasons like better pay, better opportunity, promotion, relocation, what really drove them to even seek it was they had unresolved conflict in their workplace, particularly with their immediate supervisor. And so that's why I really stress early intervention. And we use mediation then as a tool for the specific relationship, but oftentimes it's the broader context of the team environment as well. So yours to take. And also then want to share with you, one of my early works was your emotional potential, how you show up matters. And so that goes back to, our presence as mediators, as influencers. And so this is an ebook available on Amazon. And just so you know, all the proceeds are donated to Kids Managing Conflict. I'm really invested in that program to help change the world for the kids coming forward. And so encourage you to take a look at that. Give it away as a gift to your clients. And then, what I talked about earlier, our fear-based mindset going into mediation, dealing with the dispute, dealing with the conflict. And again, I see our role as mediators as shifting from that fear-based mindset, to being open to exploring, not even understanding, but acknowledging where other people are coming from and learning from that experience to generate new options. And that's really the hallmark of collaboration. It's not compromising. I'll give up something if you give up something, but instead collaborate. If I hear what your concerns are, what your needs are, what ideas do I have for you? And then in turn, what ideas do you have for me? And so as we talk about that experience-based, we want to go to connection-based. And I draw upon the words of Theodore Roosevelt: no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's where, as mediators, by showing that more compassionate side of us, even in tough legal disputes, will help shift the parties in conflict to a better mindset so that they can be open to identifying, engaging, exploring, opportunities for closure. And I don't have the slide here, but I'll share with you another one I like to use is from, our Nobel Poet Laureate, Maya Angelou. And people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And so that's another powerful one that I encourage you to do. So I want to say thank you. We've got time for some Q&A, and here are some resources that I want to share with you. I post regularly on LinkedIn, a lot of articles and things like that. But I put here, you can get this video series on my YouTube channel. You don't have to subscribe, but you can get the series there as a resource to continue learning. And they're really short; they're like 2 or 3 minutes. And so I invite you to use those resources. They're there for you. And as I conclude here, let's connect. And having that sense of connection, again, is a way of shifting the brain in order to shift the mindset. And not only yourselves, but with your clients. Learn and grow with curiosity and courage. And you have to be courageous to be curious, and you have to be curious enough to be courageous, and share your experience. So if you liked what you've got today, I would love to hear from you, and so let me know. And again, I've been delighted to be here with you and share, and please contribute to the Maui Food Bank.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I will implement some of these things in my upcoming mediation sessions. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Dupree? Certainly, you must have something.
Here.
Yes, it's an opportunity. It's great. Here's one here in the chat. You mentioned Title VII cases. Is the Title VII case count trending up? I didn't see that on your metrics slide.
Yeah. Thank you. Great question. I took out some slides that I'd used at the presentation that Jean had seen before, just for the interest of time. Yeah, overall, we continue to see an upward tick at the EEOC level as far as filings and complaints. And so these complaints, like we talked about retaliation and disability and so forth, retaliation can cover a number of the different protected classes. And I'll have to say, as much as I work with them, I always forget one or two, but it's like, it's race, ethnicity, religion, age, sex, disability. That's 6. There's one more, and I'm not remembering what it is. That's another thing about the brain, by the way. We really only do best with 2 or 3 things to keep in mind. And if you go beyond 5, you're probably not going to remember it, even though I use it all the time. So the different types of discrimination claims, can range across those 7 areas. What we see is disability has got the greatest one. If you go back to the slide, you'll see, sex and things like that are lesser. Certainly race and ethnicity used to be much more significant as a class of discrimination. But again, that's with diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts, we've seen that come way down. But that medical, people with medical conditions, and this is a change in words. I'll just share with you that, I've been working in the field of disability even before the ADA, working with employees with medical conditions in the workplace. But, the thing is, a lot of people don't view themselves as disabled. And so that's another, it's better than handicapped. Okay, that's a really old word. But disability doesn't quite capture it either, because in today's world, a lot of us will develop, almost every one of us will develop a medical condition that may or may not affect our ability to work. And so I myself use the word medical conditions in all my work rather than disability, because in particular, like in the aftermath of COVID, we have all kinds of new medical conditions we didn't deal with before. I've been in that area of work for over 30 years, and I have never seen so much change in the type of case I mediate, as well as the changes in laws. Okay, so yes, there's definitely an uptick, and it's something to really watch. And even now with the business world mandating people to come back to work full time, that's generating a whole new slew of complaints as well for a variety of reasons. Yeah. So I see another one, the 2 B's. It's be in the moment. So be in the moment's the first one. Breathe through the moment, and then break free from the moment. So in, through, and from. Sort of like our, in mediation, we need to understand the past just long enough to recognize the impact in the present, to then use that information to make good decisions for moving forward. We can't go back and change the past, but we need to understand what happened enough so that we can work with how are people impacted today, and then to take them through to, okay, how do we resolve what's been happening today in ways that this doesn't keep happening?
As a mediator, do you have any special lines, for lack of a better word, but phrases that you use to calm people down, to kind of bring them back to center and like take a breath? Okay, let's take a minute. Here you want to vent? Let's take 5 minutes to vent, and then we'll decide. But do you have any special phrases you use to help center people?
Thank you for asking, Jean. I do. I guess I maybe should make a list of those and capture them more effectively. So again, I'll just go back to my pre-mediation. This is where I'll introduce people to some basic techniques. And even in my, as I introduce them to mediation and I open up my mediation session, I'll acknowledge that, sometimes we actually have to experience more pain about what's happened before we're ready to move forward and gain. So I'll shift that, but that little phrase I used before. So that way I'm preparing them that, things might get tough here. And so I'll remind us to do some things like, let's just all sit back for a moment, because even just sitting back changes the body structure and opens up the diaphragm. And let's just take a couple of breaths. Let's just process what's being said and give ourselves a moment. Even directing people, let's just all take a cup of coffee or a glass of water. Let's all just take a sip. Because again, that physical activity of doing that actually redirects it to the motor control centers, which are on either side of the limbic brain. And so let's everyone stand up. Let's go walk outside for a few moments. Drop a pen, and then that just the noise and your action of picking up the pen off the floor, for example, again causes their brain to redirect to the motor control centers, which gets them out of the limbic brain. So I'll tell you what, I will put together some of the phrases that I come up with. I think that's a good idea. But there are these little techniques. It's not rocket science, but little techniques. If we know what to do, there are little ways to redirect the mindset of those involved.
Yes, absolutely. Here's another question in the chat. Thank you for that. Before we move on, if it takes 24 to 72 hours for physiology, excuse me, to recover from an emotional experience, does that mean that when we have to shut down a mediation because emotions are running too high, should we not reconvene for 3 days? Often we take a 20-minute break, then go back at it.
Yeah. Great question. I oftentimes will check in with the parties. We've got some options here. Many times shorter breaks like the 20 minutes will be very good to help people sort of get out of the intensity of the moment and they're ready to come back in. But that doesn't mean that they still aren't physiologically reacting to that. So I might ask is that, we could conclude right now with the agreement that we're going to reconvene. And what would be ideal if we could do it within 72 hours, but with depends on schedules. But we definitely want to try to do it within 2 weeks. So there's some physiology that goes into those timing sequences. If we go too far out, then people sort of forget their attachment to what happened in the session. And so then we're having to sort of rebuild what's going on. So short breaks, longer breaks, interrupting the process rather than just hammering at it is better physiologically. I know in the Navy model that I worked with for 20 years as I mentored mediators, we always, of course, did the opening, we did the agenda setting. We actually always did a joint session, and that was required. But then we went into caucus, and I really learned to love that model because it gave me an opportunity after hearing everybody's story to then really work with each of the parties about how I could shift them even further, and help them craft proposals that they could bring back to the table. Talk about getting the employer to say an apology, for example, or the employee for that matter, and then coming back. And we often using that model, we were oftentimes able to reach agreement within 6 hours. Although like the one I had, we were there till 9 o'clock on a Friday night. But giving them that caucus break after the joint session allowed people to calm down, and I would give them directions about what I wanted them to think about to come back to the joint session. So there's no fast and hard rule here, but again, I'm trying to educate you as far as what we know physiologically. It can take as much as 72 hours for that charged up state, that emotional intensity to slow back down. It doesn't mean that they're not capable of decision making, but if we try to hammer at it in those moments of emotional intensity, there will be emotional decision making because we do make decisions in emotional moments, but they're oftentimes not well balanced. Okay, they don't have that solid cognitive component to them, and so we want to try to avert that. I believe as our ethical responsibility as mediators to make good balanced decisions, not rash emotional decisions.
Sounds good. Thank you. Stephen Kramer, you posted something very interesting here in the chat. Why don't you unmute yourself and tell us one of your techniques?
I have an 80-pound tortoise that lives in the backyard. She lives in a 10-foot deep hole, and she comes up and eats grass every day. She actually mows my lawn. I only mow once or twice a year. But there've been a couple times when things are getting kind of tense, and I'll take, the party out back to meet Shelly. And, she's huge. You can pet her head and feed her a cactus pad or something. And it resets them. I had one case that the guy looked out the back, an insurance adjuster, and he goes, "What's that?" And I explained. And he goes, "I got to meet her." And they were this close. And I said, "Not until the case settles." And within a few minutes, the case settled, and he went out to meet Shelly.
I love that, Steve, because what you did is that you used Shelly to feed the reward system. increasing their dopamine, opening them up for resolution. Yeah, yeah. And I will share with you, I was telling at the parties earlier that my dog of 14 and a half years just passed away, but I would bring her in and or show I would always, have a slide or, have a picture, or I'd actually bring her in and would say, well, meet Snickers, and sometimes people would, let her, would sit on my lap because that would keep them calm. Yeah.
And on
So
that
about
note,
those techniques. Yeah.
yeah, great notes, whether we have Shelley or Snickers or whoever, whatever you have. Yes, Steve, one comment and then it's the top
Yeah,
of the
one quick
hour and
comment.
we're finished.
The technique about how you're going to feel tomorrow, I didn't know there was a name for it, but it works. I mean, when cases are close, I sometimes say to the party, think how you're going to feel tomorrow. If they just need to move a little bit, and think how good it'll feel. This is over. You don't have to, and it is really effective.
Yeah.
I
No,
agree.
it definitely is. Yep. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
So thank you so much, Dr. Dupree. Thank you everyone for being here. Next week, same time, same place, different Zoom link. Sign up now and make your donation if you can and let us know. And it's great to be here with you. Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.